I never imagined that saving my sister's life would be the thing that finally destroyed our family, but as I stood in that hospital corridor watching my parents embrace her while pretending I didn't exist, I realized some betrayals cut so deep that forgiveness becomes impossible. My name is Victoria Hartwell, I'm 28 years old, and the scar on my abdomen is a permanent reminder that even literal pieces of yourself aren't enough to earn love from people who've already decided you don't matter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the coastal town of Monterey, California, I learned early that my existence served a singular purpose in the Hartwell family dynamics. I was the responsible one, the achiever, the daughter who required no maintenance, while my younger sister Isabel commanded every ounce of our parents' attention, energy, and emotional bandwidth. My father, Gregory Hartwell, owned a successful architectural firm that specialized in luxury coastal properties, and my mother, Diane, dedicated herself to maintaining the family's image within our affluent community. They weren't neglectful in the traditional sense. We lived in a beautiful home overlooking the Pacific, attended excellent schools, and wanted for nothing materially. But emotional availability operated on a strict hierarchy, and I ranked consistently at the bottom. My earliest memory of this pattern occurred when I was 7 years old. I had spent weeks preparing for my first piano recital, practicing scales and simple melodies until my fingers ached. The recital fell on a Saturday afternoon in April, and my parents had promised to sit in the front row. That morning, Isabel, who was 4 at the time, decided she wanted to go to the aquarium instead. She threw a spectacular tantrum, complete with tears and dramatic declarations that she would never be happy again if we didn't go see the jellyfish. My parents looked at each other with that familiar expression of weary resignation. Then my father knelt beside me and said those words I would hear countless times throughout my childhood. "Victoria, you understand, don't you? Your sister really needs this right now. You're so mature for your age. We'll catch your next recital." I performed that afternoon to an audience that included my piano teacher, other students' families, and 2 empty seats in the front row where my parents should have been. When I came home that evening, clutching the certificate I'd earned from my performance, my mother was helping Isabel arrange her new stuffed otter on her bedroom shelf. She glanced at my certificate and said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," before turning back to my sister's more pressing concerns. I learned that day to compress my needs into something small and manageable, to never require the kind of attention that Isabel received as her birthright. School became my refuge and my validation. I threw myself into academics with single-minded determination, consistently earning top grades and teacher recommendations that praised my dedication and insight. My parents attended exactly one parent-teacher conference during my entire academic career, and that was only because the principal specifically requested their presence to discuss my acceptance into the advanced placement program. They arrived 20 minutes late because Isabel had needed help choosing an outfit for a playdate, and they left early because she had called crying about a disagreement with her friend. The principal looked confused by their hasty departure, clearly expecting parents to show more interest in such exceptional news about their daughter's academic trajectory. High school intensified this dynamic. I served as editor of the school newspaper, graduated as salutatorian, and earned a full scholarship to Stanford University. Each achievement was acknowledged with distracted praise before conversation inevitably pivoted back to Isabel's latest social drama or her struggles with relatively basic coursework. I watched my parents hire expensive tutors to help her maintain a C average while my own academic excellence was treated as an expected baseline that required no celebration or encouragement. When I received my acceptance letter to Stanford, my mother's first response was to worry aloud about how Isabel would cope with me being so far away, as if my sister's emotional comfort should factor into my educational decisions. Isabel and I existed in separate universes despite sharing a home. She was beautiful in that effortless way that draws people instinctively, with our mother's blonde hair and delicate features that photographed like something from a magazine. I took after our father's side of the family with darker coloring and features that were pleasant but unremarkable. Isabel floated through life expecting doors to open and people to accommodate her whims, while I learned to open my own doors and accommodate everyone else. We weren't close, but neither were we enemies. She simply occupied the center of our family's universe while I orbited at a safe distance, visible only when my trajectory intersected with something that required my particular skills or resources. College provided the physical distance I desperately needed. At Stanford, I discovered what it felt like to be seen and valued for my actual qualities rather than constantly compared to my sister and found lacking. I excelled in my economics program, made genuine friendships with people who appreciated my dry humor and analytical mind, and built a life where my worth wasn't constantly measured against someone else's needs. I called home dutifully every Sunday, listening to lengthy updates about Isabel's college experience at a local private school where she was majoring in communications and minoring in what my parents referred to as finding herself. My own achievements, including making Dean's List every semester and securing a competitive internship at a San Francisco investment firm, were met with brief congratulations before the conversation returned to its natural center of gravity. After graduation, I accepted a position at Morrison Securities, a mid-sized investment firm with an excellent reputation and clear advancement opportunities. I moved into a modest apartment in the Richmond district and dedicated myself to building a career that would provide the independence I craved. My professional life flourished in ways my personal life never had. Colleagues sought my analysis on complex investments, supervisors praised my attention to detail and strategic thinking, and clients specifically requested to work with me. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely valued for who I was rather than tolerated as the less interesting sister. Meanwhile, Isabel drifted through a series of jobs that never quite worked out. She tried working at a boutique but found retail exhausting. She briefly worked as a receptionist at a yoga studio but quit because the early morning hours conflicted with her social schedule. She took a position at an art gallery that seemed promising until she decided the owner was too demanding. Each job ended with our parents commiserating about how difficult it was to find the right fit, how the working world didn't appreciate Isabel's creative spirit, how she just needed time to discover her true calling. Financial support flowed freely from their accounts to hers, subsidizing an apartment she couldn't afford and a lifestyle that bore no relationship to her actual earning capacity. I was 25 when everything changed. Isabel had been complaining of fatigue and unusual bruising for several weeks, symptoms my parents initially dismissed as stress from her latest job search. When she finally consented to see a doctor, the tests came back with devastating results. Acute myeloid leukemia, aggressive and requiring immediate treatment. The diagnosis sent shockwaves through our family, transforming our already Isabel-centric dynamic into something even more intense. Every conversation, every thought, every ounce of emotional energy focused on her illness and treatment plan. I drove down from San Francisco the day we received the diagnosis, walking into the hospital room to find my parents on either side of Isabel's bed, holding her hands while she cried. I stood in the doorway for several moments before anyone acknowledged my presence, and when my father finally looked up, his eyes were hollow with fear. The oncologist explained that Isabel would need aggressive chemotherapy followed by a bone marrow transplant if they could find a suitable donor. The words hung in the air like a death sentence as we all processed what lay ahead. The following weeks blurred into a nightmare of tests, treatments, and watching my sister's vibrant beauty ravaged by poison meant to save her life. Her hair fell out in clumps, her skin took on a grayish pallor, and the effervescent personality that had always commanded attention became subdued by exhaustion and fear. My parents essentially moved into her apartment, taking turns staying overnight and managing the logistics of her care. I visited when I could, driving down after work and on weekends, sitting in waiting rooms and trying to be useful in ways that felt inadequate against the magnitude of what we faced. The chemotherapy bought us time but not a cure. Isabel needed a bone marrow transplant, and the search for a donor began immediately. My parents were tested first, but neither proved to be a match. Extended family members volunteered, and several friends underwent testing in a show of support that moved us all deeply. Each negative result felt like another door closing until finally, inevitably, the focus turned to me. I was her sister, shared genetics, the most likely match outside of our parents. I underwent testing with a strange mixture of hope and dread, knowing that a positive result would change everything. When the call came confirming I was a perfect match, 10 out of 10 markers, I felt the weight of it settle over me like a physical thing. The transplant coordinator explained the process with clinical efficiency. They would harvest stem cells from my bone marrow, a procedure that carried risks and would require general anesthesia. I would need to undergo preliminary tests, take medications to increase stem cell production, and plan for a recovery period of several weeks. The coordinator emphasized that I could decline at any point, that donors always had the right to withdraw consent, but we both knew that option existed only in theory. How could I refuse to save my sister's life? My parents received the news with overwhelming relief. My mother actually hugged me, a rare physical expression of affection that felt uncomfortable in its unfamiliarity. My father shook my hand formally and said, "We're so grateful, Victoria," as if I were a generous stranger rather than his daughter. Isabel cried when they told her, thanking me repeatedly through tears, promising she would never forget this gift I was giving her. In that moment, surrounded by my family's gratitude and relief, I felt something I had rarely experienced in the Hartwell household. I felt necessary. Not just useful or convenient, but genuinely essential to their happiness. The weeks leading up to the transplant were consumed with medical preparations. I underwent extensive testing to ensure I was healthy enough to donate, took daily injections to boost my stem cell production, and attended counseling sessions designed to prepare me for the physical and emotional impact of the procedure. My employer was supportive, granting me medical leave and assuring me my position would be waiting when I recovered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Friends offered to help with meals and errands, creating a network of support that reminded me I had built something valuable outside my family's orbit. My parents' attention during this period remained laser-focused on Isabel's preparation for the transplant. They discussed her anti-rejection medications, her isolation requirements post-transplant, and the renovations they were making to her apartment to create a sterile environment for her recovery. My own upcoming surgery was mentioned primarily in terms of how it would benefit Isabel, the timing coordinated around her optimal treatment window rather than my professional or personal schedule. I told myself this was natural and appropriate. Isabel was fighting for her life. My temporary discomfort paled in comparison to her existential crisis. The donation procedure took place on a Thursday morning in late September. I checked into the hospital the night before, occupying a room 2 floors above where Isabel was being prepared to receive my stem cells. My parents stopped by briefly to thank me again, their visit lasting perhaps 15 minutes before they returned to Isabel's room where they were needed more. I spent that evening alone, watching television and trying not to think too hard about the surgery scheduled for early morning. The procedure itself exists in my memory as fragments. The anesthesiologist's calm voice counting backward, the strange floating sensation as consciousness slipped away, the profound disorientation of waking up with pain radiating from my hip bones where they had harvested the marrow. A nurse explained that everything had gone perfectly, that they had collected an excellent quantity of stem cells, and that Isabel was receiving the transplant as we spoke. I drifted in and out of medicated sleep, alone in my hospital room, while 2 floors above my parents maintained vigil at my sister's bedside. I spent 2 nights in the hospital recovering from the donation. My parents visited once each day, staying long enough to verify I was healing appropriately before rushing back to Isabel's side. They brought me flowers and a card signed by extended family members, thanking me for my sacrifice and courage. The language felt strange, as if I had made some magnanimous choice rather than done what any sibling would do when faced with such circumstances. On the 3rd day, I was discharged with pain medication and instructions to rest for several weeks while my body replenished the bone marrow I had donated. My recovery took place in my Richmond district apartment, largely alone. Friends visited when they could, bringing food and keeping me company during the long, painful days when even simple movements felt exhausting. My parents called occasionally with updates on Isabel's progress. The transplant had been successful. Her body was accepting the new stem cells. The risk of rejection decreased with each passing day. They spoke with such relief and gratitude, celebrating this medical miracle that had saved their daughter's life. I listened from my couch, managing my own pain with prescription medication, and wondered if it occurred to them that I might need something beyond occasional phone updates. 6 weeks after the transplant, Isabel was declared stable enough to continue recovery at home. My parents threw a small celebration dinner, inviting close family members to mark this milestone. I attended despite still feeling physically depleted, driving down from San Francisco because missing such an event would have been unconscionable. The evening was filled with toasts to Isabel's courage and strength, to the miracle of modern medicine, to the hope of full recovery. Several people mentioned my donation in passing, acknowledging it as one factor among many that had contributed to the positive outcome. What struck me most profoundly that evening was a moment I witnessed between my parents and Isabel. We were gathered in the living room, and my mother was stroking Isabel's hair, which was just beginning to grow back in soft patches. My father sat on her other side, holding her hand, and the three of them formed this complete unit of mutual love and support. My mother said something about how grateful she was to still have her baby girl, and Isabel started crying, and they all embraced in this moment of raw emotion and relief. I sat across the room, watching this display of family intimacy, and realized with perfect clarity that I could have died on that operating table and their grief would have been temporary, overshadowed by relief that Isabel had received the transplant she needed. The months following Isabel's recovery should have brought our family closer together. We had survived a genuine crisis. I had literally given part of myself to save my sister's life. This should have forged an unbreakable bond, created a foundation of gratitude and mutual appreciation that transcended our previous dynamic. Instead, once the immediate crisis passed, everything returned to its familiar patterns with depressing predictability. Isabel regained her health and her looks, her hair growing back thicker than before. She returned to her previous lifestyle of vague job searching and social activities subsidized by our parents. Our parents resumed their role as her primary support system, both emotional and financial. My own life continued along its established trajectory. I returned to work after my medical leave, throwing myself back into the demanding world of investment analysis with renewed focus. I received a promotion to senior analyst, a recognition of my professional competence that came with increased responsibility and substantially better compensation. I called my parents to share the news, and my mother's response was lovely, dear, before launching into a lengthy story about Isabel considering going back to school for a degree in interior design. My father didn't even pretend interest, asking me to hold for a moment before the call disconnected, presumably because something more pressing required his attention. 2 years passed in this manner. Isabel's health remained stable, her regular checkups showing no signs of cancer recurrence. The transplant had worked exactly as hoped, giving her a second chance at life that she filled with the same aimless pursuits that had characterized her pre-cancer existence. She dated sporadically, tried various hobbies without committing to any, and continued to rely heavily on our parents for financial and emotional support. I built equity in a modest condo I had purchased in the Sunset District, maintained meaningful friendships with colleagues and former classmates, and cultivated a life that felt satisfying despite its solitary nature. The event that finally shattered my remaining illusions about my place in the Hartwell family occurred on what should have been a day of celebration. Isabel had met someone, a man named Derek who worked in pharmaceutical sales and seemed to possess both stability and genuine affection for her. Their relationship progressed quickly, and after 8 months of dating, Derek proposed during a weekend trip to Napa Valley. Isabel called our parents immediately, and they insisted on hosting an engagement party to celebrate and introduce Derek to extended family and their social circle. The party was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in early June, to be held at my parents' home with catering, live music, and approximately 75 guests. My mother had been planning for weeks, obsessing over every detail in that way she reserved for events centered around Isabel. I had been assigned exactly one task: to bring a bottle of champagne and arrive early to help set up. I found this role appropriately minimal, requiring nothing more than my presence and a contribution to the festivities. The morning of the party, I woke with unusual optimism. Perhaps this would be a turning point. Isabel was building a life with someone who seemed decent and employed. Our parents might finally relax their stranglehold on her existence and develop interests beyond managing her various needs. I might be able to establish a different relationship with my family, one built on adult mutual respect rather than childhood patterns that had calcified over decades. I selected a nice dress, nothing that would draw attention from the bride-to-be but appropriate for the occasion, and drove down the coast to Monterey with the expensive champagne I had selected as my contribution. I arrived at my parents' home 2 hours before the party's official start time, as my mother had requested. The house was already transformed, with rental furniture dotting the terraces, flowers arranged in elaborate displays, and catering staff preparing food in the kitchen. I found my mother directing this chaos with the intensity of a military general, and I offered my assistance. She handed me a list of tasks related to table settings and guest flow management, things that required attention to detail but no actual decision-making authority. I completed these assignments dutifully, working alongside the hired help while my mother continued her supervisory role. Isabel arrived an hour later, looking radiant in a white sundress that emphasized her restored health and happiness. Derek accompanied her, seeming slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the event but good-natured about the attention. My parents immediately swept in, embracing Isabel and drawing Derek into animated conversation about wedding plans and timeline considerations. I continued arranging place cards while my family formed their familiar triangle, closed off to outside participation. Guests began arriving promptly at noon, filling the house and gardens with conversation and laughter. I recognized many faces from childhood, family friends, and business associates who had known us for years. I moved through the crowd making polite conversation, answering questions about my work and my life in San Francisco with practiced ease. Several people asked if I was dating anyone, expressing concern about my single status with that particular tone of pity reserved for unmarried women approaching 30. I deflected these inquiries with humor, unwilling to explain that building genuine intimacy proved challenging when you had spent your formative years learning that your needs and feelings were fundamentally less important than someone else's. The formal announcement came after most guests had arrived and been served their first round of drinks. My father stood on the terrace, tapping his glass to gain everyone's attention. He launched into a speech about Isabel and Derek, about young love and new beginnings, about how proud he and my mother were to welcome Derek into the family. He spoke eloquently about Isabel's journey, acknowledging her battle with cancer and her remarkable recovery as evidence of her strength and resilience. The crowd responded with warm applause and raised glasses, celebrating this young couple and their promising future. As the speech concluded and guests resumed their conversations, my mother approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She guided me away from the crowd, toward a quiet corner of the garden where we could speak privately. For a moment, I thought she might be about to thank me for helping with preparations or acknowledge my presence at this family milestone. Instead, she clasped her hands together in that way she did when preparing to ask something significant and said, "Victoria, your father and I have been discussing Isabel's wedding plans with her, and we want to talk to you about a financial matter." The words sent an immediate chill down my spine. Financial matter involving my sister inevitably meant they wanted money from me. My mother continued speaking, explaining that Isabel and Derek hoped to have a wedding at the country club, the same venue where my parents had married 35 years earlier. The package they wanted was comprehensive and expensive, including ceremony space, reception dinner for 200 guests, premium bar service, and accommodations for out-of-town family. The total cost would exceed $80,000, a sum that my parents were prepared to contribute to substantially but not cover completely. "Your father and I will be paying for the majority of the wedding," my mother explained, "but we thought it would be wonderful if you could contribute as well. After all, Isabel did receive your bone marrow, and this is a chance to celebrate the life you helped save." The words landed with devastating precision. My donation, which I had undergone at significant personal cost and risk, was now being framed as a debt that required additional payment. The transplant that had saved my sister's life was being weaponized as justification for financing her expensive wedding celebration. I stood in that garden, surrounded by the sounds of party conversation and laughter, and felt something inside me break cleanly in two. "How much are you asking me to contribute?" I heard myself ask, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. My mother named a figure that represented 3 months of my salary. A contribution that would significantly deplete my savings and require me to postpone the kitchen renovation I had been planning for my condo. She presented this amount as reasonable, even generous, considering the circumstances and the special bond between sisters. I looked at my mother's expectant face, at the party happening around us, at my sister across the garden laughing with her fiancé and our father. I thought about the surgery I had undergone, the weeks of painful recovery, the permanent reminder carved into my hip bone. I thought about every birthday forgotten, every achievement overlooked, every moment when my needs had been compressed and minimized to make room for Isabel's infinite requirements. And I thought about the fact that this request wasn't presented as a question but as an expectation, as if my contribution was already assumed and this conversation was merely a formality to discuss logistics. "I need to think about this," I said finally, unwilling to create a scene at my sister's engagement party but equally unwilling to agree to this financial extraction. My mother's face fell, disappointment evident in every line. "We were hoping you would be excited to help," she said, a note of reproach entering her voice. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime event for your sister." "I understand that," I replied, "but $80,000 is a significant request, and I need time to consider my financial situation before committing to such a large contribution." The conversation ended awkwardly, my mother returning to the party with visible displeasure while I remained in the garden trying to process what had just occurred. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow pleasantries. I watched my family celebrate Isabel's engagement, toasting to her happiness and future, and realized with absolute clarity that I would never escape the role they had assigned me. I was the resource to be tapped, the responsible one who could be relied upon for practical support while emotional connection remained perpetually out of reach. I left the party earlier than planned, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. Isabel hugged me goodbye with absent affection, already turning back to her other guests before I had fully released her. My parents walked me to my car, my mother reminding me to think seriously about the wedding contribution and let them know my decision soon so they could finalize payments. I drove back to San Francisco as sunset painted the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson, and I knew with certainty that something fundamental had shifted. I could no longer pretend that our family dynamic would ever change or that my value extended beyond what I could provide in moments of crisis. The weeks following the engagement party brought increasing pressure regarding the wedding contribution. My mother called regularly, each conversation beginning with innocuous small talk before pivoting to the wedding plans and the urgency of finalizing financial commitments. My father sent emails with spreadsheets breaking down costs and showing how my proposed contribution fit into the overall budget. Isabel herself finally called, employing a combination of pleading and guilt that felt both familiar and newly intolerable. "You saved my life, Victoria. Don't you want to help make my wedding day special?" The equation was explicit: my bone marrow plus tens of thousands of dollars equals adequate proof of sisterly love. I consulted with a therapist, someone I had begun seeing intermittently after the transplant, to process the complex emotions surrounding that experience. Dr. Sarah Chen listened as I described the wedding contribution request, the lifetime of favoritism and emotional neglect, and the growing resentment that threatened to consume me entirely. Her response was measured but clear: "You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, even if those people are family. The boundary you set around this financial request is not only reasonable but necessary for your own well-being." Armed with this validation, I drafted an email to my parents explaining that I would not be contributing to Isabel's wedding fund. I kept the language neutral and factual, emphasizing my own financial priorities and the need to maintain my savings for future goals. I did not mention the bone marrow donation or the years of neglect, unwilling to open those wounds in written communication that could be forwarded and dissected by family members. I sent the email on a Tuesday evening and then turned off my phone, unwilling to deal with immediate fallout. The response came in multiple forms. My mother called and left increasingly agitated voicemails questioning my selfishness and lack of family loyalty. My father sent a brief, cold email expressing profound disappointment in my decision and suggesting I reconsider before damaging family relationships irreparably. Isabel's text messages oscillated between hurt and anger, accusing me of jealousy and cruelty for refusing to support her during this important life moment. Extended family members began reaching out, having apparently been told some version of events that painted me as unreasonably withholding support from my sister's wedding. I held firm despite the pressure, repeating the same message to anyone who asked. I had made a decision based on my financial reality, and that decision was final. The concept seemed foreign to my family, the idea that I might prioritize my own needs over Isabel's desires apparently unimaginable within our established dynamic. My refusal created a rift that widened with each passing day, conversations becoming increasingly strained and eventually ceasing altogether. My parents stopped calling. Isabel unfriended me on social media. The wedding planning continued without my input or participation, and I existed in a strange limbo of knowing I had made the right choice while grieving the family connections that were dissolving as a consequence. 3 months after I declined to contribute to the wedding fund, I received a formal invitation to Isabel's wedding. The heavy cardstock announced an evening ceremony at the country club followed by dinner and dancing, exactly the expensive celebration my parents had wanted me to help finance. My name appeared on the envelope alone, no +1 offered, while I knew from mutual acquaintances that most guests had been invited to bring partners. The message was clear. I was welcome to attend in the most minimal capacity possible, occupying a seat and witnessing Isabel's happiness without playing any meaningful role in the festivities. I RSVP'd that I would not be attending, citing a work commitment that was fictional but plausible. The truth was that I could not imagine sitting through an entire evening celebrating my sister while knowing that my family viewed my donation of bone marrow as insufficient proof of sisterly devotion. The transplant that had saved Isabel's life should have been the ultimate demonstration of love, but instead, it had been reduced to a down payment on an endless series of future obligations and contributions. The wedding took place on a Saturday in October, a date I knew only because several people posted photos on social media despite Isabel having blocked me from seeing her accounts directly. I spent that day hiking in Marin County, deliberately avoiding any technology that might deliver unwanted updates about the celebration. I returned home exhausted and sunburned, successfully having avoided thinking about my sister's wedding for the majority of the day. That evening, my phone contained a single text message from an aunt I rarely spoke with, saying only, "I'm sorry your family has made such poor choices. I hope you know you did nothing wrong." The months that followed were characterized by complete silence from my parents and Isabel. No calls on my birthday, no holiday greetings, no casual check-ins or updates. I had been effectively excised from the family, my refusal to finance Isabel's wedding apparently constituting an unforgivable betrayal that warranted permanent estrangement. I told myself this was for the best, that distance from toxic family dynamics would allow me to heal and build healthier relationships elsewhere. But the grief was real and profound, mourning not just my current family connections but the fantasy of what those connections might have been under different circumstances. Work became my primary focus, providing structure and validation that my family had never offered. I received another promotion, this time to managing director, a position that came with significant authority and compensation. I purchased a small beach house in Bolinas as a weekend retreat, creating a sanctuary where I could escape the demands of professional life and cultivate the peace that eluded me elsewhere. I dated occasionally but found it difficult to envision building a future with someone when I carried so much unprocessed pain from my family of origin. 18 months after Isabel's wedding, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously, and my mother's voice came through the line, subdued in a way I had never heard before. "Victoria, I need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet?" The request triggered immediate suspicion. Important to my mother invariably meant Isabel needed something, and after months of silence, I couldn't imagine what might have prompted this outreach beyond another crisis requiring my resources or assistance. We met at a cafe in Carmel, neutral territory between Monterey and San Francisco. My mother arrived looking older than I remembered, her carefully maintained appearance showing signs of strain. She ordered coffee and then sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "Isabel's cancer is back. The doctors found it during a routine checkup last week. It's aggressive, and they're recommending another round of chemotherapy followed by a second bone marrow transplant if they can find a match." The words should have devastated me. My sister was facing a recurrence of the disease that had nearly killed her, and the treatment would be just as brutal as before. But sitting across from my mother in that cafe, I felt only a detached numbness, as if she were describing something happening to a stranger rather than my only sibling. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said finally, and I genuinely was sorry that anyone had to endure cancer treatment twice. But I couldn't summon the emotional response my mother clearly expected, the immediate mobilization of resources and energy towards saving Isabel once again. My mother's next words came in a rush, as if she had rehearsed this speech multiple times. "The doctors said you're still in the system as a previous match. They want to test you again to see if you're still compatible for donation. Your father and I are hoping you'll agree to undergo testing and, if you match, to donate again. Isabel needs this, Victoria. She needs her sister." I stared at my mother across the small table, understanding with perfect clarity what was being asked of me. After months of silence, after being excised from family events and treated as persona non grata for refusing to finance a wedding, I was suddenly valuable again. My bone marrow, the literal pieces of myself I could provide, made me relevant in a way my presence and feelings never had. The transplant that should have bonded us as sisters had instead become a transaction they expected me to repeat whenever circumstances demanded. "I'll need to think about it," I said, using the same words I had employed when asked to contribute to the wedding fund. My mother's face collapsed into something between shock and anger. "Think about it? Victoria, this is your sister's life we're talking about. You can't seriously be considering refusing to help her." I stood up from the table, suddenly unable to sit still under the weight of her expectations. I underwent a painful medical procedure to save Isabel's life once before. That donation came with risks and a difficult recovery, and when it was over, you asked me to pay for her wedding as thanks. Now she's sick again, and you expect me to simply agree to go through it all over again without any acknowledgement of how I'd been treated. My mother's shock gave way to indignation. "How you've been treated? Isabel is fighting cancer, and you're making this about your hurt feelings over a wedding?" The dismissal in her tone, the automatic minimization of my legitimate grievances, crystallized everything that had always been wrong in our family. Isabel's needs, Isabel's pain, Isabel's very existence would always matter more than mine, and any attempt to assert my own value would be reframed as selfishness or pettiness. "I need time to make this decision," I repeated, gathering my belongings. "This isn't something I'm going to agree to on the spot, especially given our family history." I walked out of the cafe without waiting for her response, my hands shaking as I unlocked my car. The drive back to San Francisco passed in a blur of competing emotions, anger and guilt and grief tangling together until I couldn't distinguish one from another. The phone calls started that evening and continued for days. My father left voicemails using language about family obligation and moral responsibility. Isabel called crying, begging me not to punish her for our parents' mistakes. Extended family members weighed in with opinions ranging from supportive to condemning, everyone suddenly invested in my decision about whether to undergo another bone marrow donation. The pressure was immense and unrelenting, designed to wear down my resistance until I capitulated to their demands. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Chin to discuss the situation, needing professional guidance to navigate these impossible emotional waters. She listened carefully as I described the history, the recent reconciliation, and the expectations now being placed on me. Her response was both compassionate and clear. "You are not morally obligated to donate bone marrow to anyone, even a family member, even a sibling whose life might depend on it. That decision belongs to you alone, and whatever you choose will be valid and defensible." But I struggled with the weight of it. Could I live with myself if I refused and Isabel died? Would I carry that guilt forever, knowing I had the power to save her and chose not to exercise it? Dr. Chin helped me reframe these questions in productive ways. What kind of relationship would I have with my family if I donated under these circumstances, feeling coerced and resentful throughout the process? What message would I send about my own value if I allowed myself to be treated as a resource to be tapped only during crises? What recovery would look like emotionally as well as physically if I underwent this procedure while carrying unresolved anger and hurt? After 2 weeks of reflection, therapy sessions, and consultation with a medical ethicist who specialized in living donation ethics, I made my decision. I called my mother and arranged another meeting, this time insisting my father attend as well. We met at their home, sitting in the formal living room that had hosted countless family gatherings I had attended as an obligatory participant rather than a welcomed guest. "I've made my decision about the bone marrow donation," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I'm willing to undergo testing to see if I'm still a match, and if I am, I will donate again." My parents' faces flooded with relief, my mother actually gasping and reaching for my father's hand. "But before you celebrate, I have conditions that are non-negotiable. If you cannot agree to these terms, my offer is withdrawn immediately." The relief in their faces shifted to confusion and apprehension. "What kind of conditions?" my father asked, his tone suggesting this was inappropriate mercenary behavior. I pulled out a sheet of paper where I had written my requirements, needing the physical documentation to stay focused and clear. "First, before any donation takes place, we will attend family therapy together. Not a single session, but ongoing counseling with a qualified therapist who specializes in family systems and patterns of favoritism. All of us, including Isabel and her husband, will participate actively and honestly. Second, there will be no financial requests made of me related to Isabel's care, recovery, or future life events. No subtle hints, no direct asks, no expectations that I will subsidize her lifestyle or choices. Third, if I agree to donate, I expect the same level of care and attention during my recovery that Isabel received during hers. Hospital visits, help at home, acknowledgement of the physical toll this procedure takes. I will not be left alone to manage my recovery while you focus exclusively on Isabel's needs. My mother started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. Fourth, you will publicly acknowledge, to our extended family and your social circle, the pattern of favoritism that has characterized our family dynamics and your role in creating and maintaining that imbalance. Not as a way to humiliate you, but as an accountability measure that ensures everyone understands the full context of this situation. And finally, going forward, our relationship will be built on mutual respect and genuine care, or it will not exist at all. I'm done accepting crumbs of attention and affection while watching Isabel receive the full measure of your love. The silence that followed my declaration felt endless. My father's face had hardened into something unreadable, while my mother looked between us as if waiting for someone to speak first. Finally, my father cleared his throat. These conditions are unreasonable, Victoria. We're talking about your sister's life, and you're trying to leverage that into some kind of therapy ultimatum and public humiliation for your mother and me. I stood up, folding the paper and putting it back in my bag. Then we have nothing further to discuss. I hope you find another donor for Isabel. I wish her nothing but the best in her treatment and recovery. I walked toward the door, half expecting them to call me back, to agree to my terms rather than lose access to my bone marrow. Instead, silence followed me out of their house and to my car. As I drove away, I saw my mother standing in the window, watching me leave, her expression something between devastation and fury. The aftermath was swift and brutal. My parents initiated a family-wide campaign presenting me as heartless and vindictive, someone willing to let her sister die rather than donate bone marrow without preconditions. The narrative they constructed painted me as jealous, selfish, and fundamentally damaged. Isabel gave interviews to local news outlets about her cancer battle and her desperate search for a bone marrow donor, carefully omitting the fact that a perfect match existed in her sister who had donated once before but was now refusing under mysterious circumstances. Social media exploded with judgment from people who knew nothing about our family history or the conditions that had led to my decision. Strangers sent me hateful messages calling me a monster and wishing various terrible outcomes upon me. Former family friends reached out to express their disappointment and incomprehension. A few people, very few, contacted me privately to say they suspected there was more to the story and offered their support without asking for details I wasn't ready to share. I weathered this storm the same way I had weathered every previous family crisis, by focusing on work, leaning on my chosen support system, and trusting that I had made the right decision even when that decision came with devastating consequences. Dr. Chen helped me process the grief of losing my family of origin while simultaneously honoring the boundaries I had finally managed to establish. My closest friends rallied around me, creating a buffer against the outside judgment and providing the unconditional support my biological family had never offered. 6 weeks after I declined to donate without my conditions being met, I learned through a mutual acquaintance that Isabel had found an unrelated donor through the National Registry. The match wasn't as strong as a sibling donation would have been, but it was compatible enough to proceed with the transplant. My initial reaction was profound relief. My sister would receive the treatment she needed without requiring anything from me, removing the impossible weight of her life resting on my decision. But alongside that relief came a more complex emotion, something like grief mixed with validation. The fact that they had found another option so quickly suggested my bone marrow had never been as essential as they claimed. I had been the convenient choice, the easy solution, but not the only possibility. Isabel's second transplant took place in early December. I learned about it the same way I learned everything about my family now, through secondhand sources and social media posts I was no longer tagged in. The procedure was apparently successful, her body accepting the new stem cells without immediate complications. My parents posted grateful updates thanking the anonymous donor who had saved their daughter's life, photographs of Isabel in her hospital room surrounded by flowers and balloons. Notably absent were any mentions of her previous transplant or the sister who had provided those life-saving stem cells years earlier. The holidays passed quietly. I spent Thanksgiving with close friends in their home in Oakland, contributing to a potluck dinner and feeling genuinely grateful for chosen family that actually showed up consistently. Christmas found me at my beach house in Bolinas, walking the winter shoreline and reading books I had been meaning to get to for months. New Year's Eve I celebrated at a small party hosted by colleagues from work, toasting to fresh starts and leaving difficult years behind. For the first time in my adult life, I experienced major holidays without the obligatory drive to Monterey, without forcing myself into family gatherings where I existed only at the margins, and the absence felt more like freedom than loss. January brought unexpected contact from an unfamiliar source. I received a phone call from Derek, Isabel's husband, whom I barely knew beyond our brief interactions at the engagement party. He asked if we could meet for coffee, saying he had something he wanted to discuss that he felt I deserved to hear. Curiosity outweighed my reluctance, and I agreed to meet him at a cafe in Half Moon Bay, roughly halfway between our respective locations. Derek arrived looking exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from prolonged caregiving and stress. He ordered coffee and then launched into what felt like a prepared speech. "I need to tell you something about Isabel's transplant and the situation with your family. I've watched how they've treated you, and it's not right. You deserve to know the full story." What followed was a revelation that fundamentally changed my understanding of everything that had happened. According to Derek, when my parents had approached me about the second donation, they had already known about several potential donors in the National Registry. The story they had told me about desperate searches and limited options had been a fabrication designed to pressure me into agreeing quickly. They wanted my stem cells specifically because a sibling donation carried better long-term outcomes, but they had backup options they deliberately concealed to make my refusal seem more consequential and life-threatening than it actually was. Furthermore, Derek revealed that during family discussions about the wedding contribution I had declined to make, Isabel had actually defended my decision initially. She had told our parents that 3 months of my salary was an unreasonable ask and that they should reduce the wedding budget rather than pressure me for such a large contribution. Our parents had overruled her protests, insisting that as the donor of Isabel's bone marrow, I owed her this additional support. The narrative I had received through their requests and Isabel's eventual angry messages had omitted this crucial detail: my sister's brief attempt to protect me from unfair financial exploitation. Derek continued, explaining that after I refused the second donation with my list of conditions, our parents had launched their public relations campaign against me without Isabel's knowledge or approval. She had been in the hospital preparing for chemotherapy, weakened and terrified, when she discovered that her parents were telling extended family and the media that her sister had heartlessly refused to save her life. By the time she realized what they were doing and tried to stop it, the damage was already done, the story widely circulated and impossible to retract without creating more drama. I listened to all this information feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. The situation had been so much more complex than I knew, with my sister caught between her own survival needs and her parents' manipulation of both of us. And yet, I noted that Isabel had not reached out to me directly to share any of this. She had not called to apologize for the hateful messages or to explain that our parents had misrepresented both her views and the urgency of my donation. She had allowed me to remain estranged, publicly vilified, believing I had refused to save her life out of petty vindictiveness. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Derek when he finally paused in his revelations. "Because it's eating Isabel alive," he said quietly. "She's in remission now, her prognosis is good, but she can't move forward knowing you're out there thinking she orchestrated this whole campaign against you. She wants to reach out but doesn't know how to begin after everything that's happened. She asked me to talk to you first, to explain what really went on behind the scenes." I sat with this information, processing how it fit into my understanding of my family dynamics. The revelation changed certain specifics but not the fundamental pattern. My parents had manipulated the situation to serve their preferred narrative, prioritizing Isabel's needs while minimizing or ignoring mine, and using our complex relationship to leverage outcomes that benefited them. Isabel had been complicit in some ways and victimized in others, caught in the same system that had shaped both of our lives since childhood. Would Isabel be willing to meet with me? I asked finally. Derek's face flooded with relief. Yes, absolutely. She's wanted to talk to you for months but was terrified you would refuse. We arranged a meeting for the following week, this time at my beach house in Bolinas where I felt most grounded and secure. The days leading up to that meeting were filled with anxiety and rehearsed conversations, imagining every possible outcome from hostile confrontation to tearful reconciliation. Isabel arrived on a Sunday afternoon, Derek dropping her off before making himself scarce to give us privacy. My sister looked healthier than I had seen her in years, her hair fully regrown and her color good despite the recent medical ordeal. We stood facing each other in my living room, two women who shared genetics and history but had been shaped into fundamentally different people by the same family system. "I'm sorry," Isabel said before I could speak. "I'm sorry for everything, Mom and Dad, the wedding fund, all of it. I should have done more to stop them, but I was scared and sick, and I let them turn you into a villain when you were just trying to protect yourself." The apology felt genuine, her voice breaking with emotion that seemed real rather than performed. I gestured for her to sit, and we settled into the comfortable chairs facing the ocean view. "What do you want from this conversation?" I asked, needing to understand her goals before deciding how much of myself to invest. "Do you want absolution so you can move forward without guilt? Do you want to rebuild a relationship? Do you want me to forgive Mom and Dad and restore family harmony?" Isabel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the waves. "I want to understand who you are," she said finally. "I realized recently that I don't actually know my sister. I know the person who saved my life twice, the responsible one, the smart one who didn't need anything from Mom and Dad. But I don't know what you care about, what makes you happy, what your life actually looks like beyond the surface stuff. I want a chance to meet the real Victoria instead of the role you've been forced to play in our family." Her answer surprised me, both in its honesty and its insight. We talked for hours that afternoon, sharing stories and perspectives that had never been voiced in all our years of cohabitation. I learned that Isabel had always felt tremendous pressure to be the person our parents wanted, that her directionless lifestyle stemmed partly from paralysis about disappointing them by pursuing her actual interests in environmental science. She revealed that she had dropped out of college twice before finishing because she couldn't bear failing at something our parents cared about deeply, even though higher education had never been her chosen path. In turn, I shared my experiences of growing up feeling invisible, of achieving excellence in desperate bids for attention that never materialized, of the loneliness that came from being the responsible child who required no maintenance. I told her about the bone marrow donation recovery, alone in my apartment with friends stopping by when they could but no family presence to speak of. I described the engagement party and the wedding contribution request, the dawning realization that my value to our family would always be primarily transactional. As the sun set over the Pacific, Isabel asked the question I had been waiting for. "Do you hate me?" The simple directness of it caught me off guard. "No," I said after considering it carefully. "I don't hate you, but I don't think we can have the relationship we might have had if circumstances were different. Too much has happened, and too much of who we are has been shaped by this dynamic between our parents that neither of us created but both of us have participated in maintaining. Can we try?" she asked. "Can we build something new that isn't based on all that history?" I thought about the conditions I had laid out to our parents, the boundaries I had finally learned to establish, the life I was building that felt authentic and sustainable. "Maybe," I said. "But it would have to be fundamentally different from what we've had before. No more crisis-driven contact where I only matter when you need something. No more mediating with Mom and Dad or trying to fix their dysfunction. Just two adults who happen to be sisters figuring out if they actually like each other enough to maintain a relationship." Isabel agreed to those terms, and we began the slow, uncertain process of getting to know each other outside the roles our parents had assigned us. We started with monthly video calls, brief check-ins that didn't require the emotional intensity of in-person meetings. She shared updates about her continued remission and her decision to go back to school for environmental science, finally pursuing the interest she had suppressed for years. I talked about my work in the beach house renovations I was planning, the life I was creating that reflected my actual values and desires. 6 months into this tentative reconnection, Isabel did something that fundamentally shifted our relationship. She initiated a confrontation with our parents about their treatment of me, refusing to allow them to continue the narrative that I was the villain in our family story. She corrected their misrepresentations of my refusal to donate without conditions, explained that I had valid reasons for establishing boundaries, and insisted they acknowledge their role in creating the dynamics that had damaged both of their daughters. The conversation apparently did not go well. My parents refused to accept responsibility for any wrongdoing, maintaining that they had treated both daughters equally and any perceived favoritism was in my imagination. They accused Isabel of being manipulated by me, of betraying family loyalty for temporary approval from a sister who would inevitably disappoint her. Isabel called me that evening, crying and furious, saying she finally understood what I had been dealing with for my entire life. I didn't need her to fight that battle for me, and I told her so. But the fact that she had tried, that she had been willing to risk her own relationship with our parents to defend me, meant more than she could know. For the first time in my life, my sister had chosen me over their approval, had prioritized our sibling relationship over the comfortable dynamic that had always placed her at the center of their attention. Isabel and Derek moved to San Francisco the following year, both of them accepting positions with environmental nonprofits working on coastal conservation. Having them nearby allowed for the kind of casual, spontaneous connection that phone calls and planned meetings couldn't replicate. We started meeting for coffee or walks on Ocean Beach, building the friendship that had never existed during our childhood. Derek became a genuine friend as well, his outsider perspective on our family dynamics providing validation and dark humor about the absurdity of it all. My relationship with my parents remained severed, a clean break that I maintained for my own well-being. They made occasional attempts at reconciliation, usually timed around holidays or family events, but these overtures never included the accountability or genuine change I had identified as necessary conditions. They wanted me to return to the fold without addressing the fundamental issues, to pretend the past had been different than it was, and I refused to participate in that fiction. Extended family members took various positions on the estrangement. Some sided with my parents, viewing me as unreasonably harsh and unforgiving. Others quietly reached out to offer support, sharing their own observations of favoritism they had witnessed but never commented on publicly. A few admitted they had always wondered why I seemed so disconnected from family events, now understanding that distance had been self-protection rather than disinterest. 2 years after Isabel's second transplant, I met someone who fundamentally changed my perspective on what partnership could look like. James was a fellow investor who had recently joined Morrison Securities, bringing expertise in sustainable energy projects that complemented my focus on technology and healthcare. We connected first as colleagues, appreciating each other's analytical approach and shared commitment to ethical investing. Friendship evolved gradually into something deeper, built on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's full humanity. What struck me most about James was his family, specifically the casual warmth and authentic connection that characterized their interactions. Meeting them for the first time at a Sunday dinner at his parents' home in Berkeley, I watched in fascination as they asked thoughtful questions about my work, shared stories that included everyone rather than centering one person, and moved through disagreements with direct communication instead of passive aggression or silent treatment. This was what healthy family looked like, and experiencing it highlighted just how abnormal my own upbringing had been. James knew the basics of my family situation, that I was estranged from my parents and rebuilding a relationship with my sister, but I had hesitated to share the full depth of the dysfunction. One evening several months into our relationship, I finally told him everything. The lifetime of favoritism, the bone marrow donations, the wedding fund request, the conditions I had set that led to permanent estrangement. I watched his face as I spoke, waiting for judgment or suggestions that I was overreacting, that family deserved endless chances regardless of their behavior. Instead, he took my hand and said the most validating thing I had ever heard. "That sounds incredibly painful, and you handled it with more grace and patience than most people could have managed. I'm proud of you for knowing your worth and insisting on being treated accordingly." His unconditional support, the absence of any suggestion that I should compromise my boundaries to restore family peace, felt like being truly seen for the first time. Isabel and I continued growing closer, our relationship evolving into genuine friendship untainted by our parents' dysfunction. She attended my beach house for weekend visits, helping with the renovation projects and introducing me to environmental conservation work that aligned with my own values around sustainable investing. We talked openly about our childhood, processing shared experiences from our different perspectives and supporting each other through the ongoing grief of not having the parents we deserved. When James proposed during a weekend trip to Big Sur, Isabel was the first person I called to share the news. Her joy for me felt uncomplicated and genuine, unmarred by the competitiveness or comparisons that had characterized our previous dynamic. She and Derek attended our small wedding ceremony at my beach house, along with James's family and the close friends who had supported me through my darkest moments. My parents were not invited, their absence notable but not devastating. I had built a family of choice that filled my life with authentic connection and mutual care. The years that followed brought the kind of stability and happiness I had never imagined possible. James and I built a life together that reflected both of our values, investing in sustainable projects and dedicating time to causes we believed in. Isabel's remission remained stable, her regular checkups showing no signs of cancer recurrence. She completed her environmental science degree and began working on coastal preservation projects that filled her with purpose and pride. Derek supported her completely, their marriage modeling the kind of partnership built on genuine equality and mutual support. My career continued to flourish, the promotions and recognition validating my professional competence in ways that created genuine satisfaction rather than desperately seeking external approval. I mentored younger analysts at Morrison Securities, particularly women who seemed to struggle with asserting their value and setting boundaries. I shared my own experiences selectively, helping them understand that professional success didn't require sacrificing personal well-being or accepting treatment that diminished their humanity. My parents made their final attempt at reconciliation when I was 35, 7 years after our definitive break. My father was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, and my mother called to inform me of this development and suggest that perhaps this crisis might inspire me to reconsider my position on family estrangement. The call felt like a perfect encapsulation of our entire relationship, another crisis requiring me to set aside my legitimate grievances and provide support to people who had never shown up for me consistently. I listened to my mother's update about Dad's diagnosis and prognosis, expressed genuine sympathy for what they were facing, and then calmly reiterated that my boundaries remained unchanged. I wished them well with the upcoming treatment and care planning, and I ended the call feeling sad about my father's illness but certain about my decision. Some relationships cannot be salvaged regardless of circumstances, and attempting to do so causes more harm than allowing them to end naturally. Isabel kept me updated on Dad's decline over the following years, respecting my choice not to be directly involved while understanding my continued interest as his daughter despite everything. She had her own complex relationship with their aging and illness, providing care while maintaining boundaries they sometimes respected and often tested. We supported each other through these challenges, siblings who had finally learned to show up for one another outside the roles our parents had assigned us. When my father eventually passed away, 5 years after his diagnosis, I attended the funeral as a way of marking his death rather than pursuing reconciliation with my mother. I sat in the back of the church, observing the ceremony from a distance and leaving immediately after without attending the reception. Isabel understood and supported this choice, never suggesting I owed our mother more than I was comfortable giving. My mother lived for several more years, eventually moving into an assisted living facility when maintaining her home became untenable. I contributed financially to her care through a trust arrangement that required no direct contact, ensuring she had what she needed while maintaining my boundaries. Isabel visited her regularly, their relationship complicated but functional in ways mine never could be. Looking back now at 53, I can see how the decision to prioritize my own well-being over family expectations changed the entire trajectory of my life. The bone marrow donation that should have bonded me to my sister instead became the catalyst for understanding my value extended far beyond what I could provide during crises. Walking away from my parents' demands that I donate again without conditions was the most difficult and most important decision I ever made. My life now bears little resemblance to what my parents would have chosen for me. I'm successful professionally in ways that have nothing to do with seeking their approval. My marriage to James reflects genuine partnership and mutual care. My relationship with Isabel has evolved into something authentic and valuable, two women who chose to know each other beyond the roles we were assigned. And I've built a community of chosen family who show up consistently, who value my presence for who I am rather than what I can provide. The scar on my hip remains, a permanent reminder of the transplant that saved my sister's life and, inadvertently, taught me to save my own. Sometimes I trace it with my fingers and remember the woman I was at 25, so desperate for my parents' love that I would have given anything, including potentially my life, to earn it. That woman deserved better than she received, and the woman I've become honors her by refusing to accept crumbs when I deserve the whole feast. To anyone struggling with similar family dynamics, with parents who play favorites or siblings who receive vastly different treatment, I offer this hard-won wisdom. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, regardless of shared genetics or family ties. Boundaries are not punishment but rather invitations to healthier relationships built on mutual respect. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who refuse to see your value, even when those people are family. My parents never understood what they lost when they prioritized Isabel's wedding over my legitimate needs, when they manipulated the situation around her second transplant, when they refused to acknowledge their role in creating toxic family dynamics. They died believing I was the problem, the ungrateful daughter who turned her back on family when she was needed most. I've made peace with their narrative because I know my truth, and that knowledge sustains me through moments of doubt or grief. The greatest gift of this journey has been discovering that family isn't determined by blood alone but by consistent actions demonstrating care and respect. James, his family, my closest friends, and yes, my sister Isabel and our rebuilt relationship have shown me what real family looks like. It's showing up not just during crises but in ordinary moments. It's valuing someone's presence rather than their utility. It's creating space for both joy and pain without keeping score or demanding repayment. I saved my sister's life with my bone marrow, but in the process of refusing to save it again under conditions of manipulation and disrespect, I saved my own life in ways that matter far more profoundly. And that salvation, that choice to prioritize my own well-being and insist on being treated with basic human dignity, has made all the difference. The morning after my father's funeral brought an unexpected sense of clarity rather than the crushing grief I had anticipated. I woke in my childhood bedroom, temporarily converted to a guest room years ago when my parents had redecorated to accommodate visiting friends, and felt the strange dissonance of being back in a house that had never truly felt like home. The walls were painted a neutral beige now, replacing the pale yellow I had chosen at 13, and none of my belongings remained except for a single framed photo on the dresser showing our family at some long-forgotten holiday gathering. I studied that photograph while drinking my coffee, noting how even in that frozen moment, the composition revealed our family's essential truth. My parents stood on either side of Isabel, their hands on her shoulders, while I occupied the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, as if the photographer hadn't quite decided whether to include me at all. James had offered to stay with me through the week of funeral arrangements and family obligations, but I had insisted he return to San Francisco after the service itself. His presence would have been comforting, but I needed to navigate this final chapter of my relationship with my parents without the buffer of someone who loved me unconditionally. Besides, Isabel was here, and Derek, and together we formed a small alliance against the broader family dynamics that would inevitably surface during this transitional period. My mother had died 3 years earlier from complications related to pneumonia, her passing marked by a similar funeral where I had maintained my careful distance while Isabel managed the intimate details of grief and logistics. Now with my father gone as well, we faced the dissolution of the family structure that had defined and damaged us both, and I felt surprisingly little sadness about that ending. The lawyer handling my father's estate had scheduled a reading of the will for 10 o'clock that morning, a formality that felt unnecessarily dramatic given that I expected nothing and wanted less. My parents had made their priorities clear throughout their lives, and I harbored no illusions that death would have inspired some deathbed revelation about my worth or value. Isabel had mentioned during one of our recent conversations that our parents had updated their will several years ago, after my mother's death, but she claimed not to know the specific details beyond confirming that provisions had been made for both of us. I appreciated her discretion if she did no more, her refusal to either build false hope or prepare me for disappointment. I dressed carefully for the meeting, selecting a charcoal gray suit that projected professional competence without the severity of funeral black. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman who looked capable and composed, someone who had long ago stopped seeking validation from people incapable of providing it. The scar on my abdomen remained invisible beneath layers of fabric, but I felt its presence as always, a reminder that I had given pieces of myself in pursuit of love that was never going to materialize in the forms I craved. That younger version of myself, the one who had donated bone marrow believing it might finally earn her parents' affection, felt both intimately familiar and impossibly distant. I had been so certain that grand gestures would bridge the gap between us, that if I just gave enough of myself, they would finally see me as worth their attention and care. Isabel knocked on my door at 9:30, already dressed in a simple black dress that emphasized how thin she still was despite years of stable remission. We had developed a shorthand over the past several years, a way of communicating complex emotions with minimal words, and I could read in her expression that she was nervous about the will reading for reasons she couldn't or wouldn't articulate. We drove to the lawyer's office together in her car, neither of us speaking much during the 15-minute journey through familiar Monterey streets. The silence felt companionable rather than tense, two women who had learned to be comfortable with each other's presence without constant performance or explanation. The law offices of Patterson and Associates occupied a tastefully renovated Victorian house near downtown, all polished wood and leather furniture that projected old-money discretion. We were shown into a conference room where extended family members had already gathered, aunts and uncles and cousins I recognized from childhood gatherings and holiday dinners. My Aunt Catherine gave me a warm smile and a subtle nod of acknowledgement, one of the few relatives who had maintained contact with me throughout my estrangement from my parents. Most of the others regarded me with expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly concealed hostility, still operating under the narrative my parents had constructed about my unreasonable demands and family betrayal. Jason Patterson, the senior partner handling my father's estate, entered precisely at 10 o'clock carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained the relevant documents. He was a man in his late 60s with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that successful lawyers cultivate, his silver hair precisely cut and his suit impeccably tailored. He had known my parents socially for decades, attending the same country club events and charity functions, and I wondered briefly whether his personal relationship with them would color the proceedings. He greeted everyone formally, expressing condolences that felt rehearsed but not insincere, and then settled into his chair at the head of the conference table. "Before we begin with the formal reading," Patterson said, adjusting his reading glasses and opening the portfolio before him, "I want to acknowledge that estate matters can be emotionally challenging, particularly when family dynamics are complex. My role here is simply to execute the wishes Gregory Hartwell expressed in his last will and testament, which was updated and notarized 18 months ago. I ask that everyone allow me to complete the reading before asking questions or raising concerns, as many matters will be clarified through the full document." There were murmurs of agreement around the table, and I felt Isabel shift slightly in her chair beside me, her tension palpable even without direct eye contact. Patterson began reading through the standard legal language that opened such documents, the declarations of sound mind and explicit revocation of previous wills. My attention wandered during these preliminaries, focusing instead on the view through the conference room windows where spring sunshine illuminated the Victorian gardens that surrounded the building. I had prepared myself for this moment by releasing any expectation of inheritance or acknowledgement, accepting that my parents' final act would likely mirror their lifetime pattern of prioritizing Isabel while minimizing my existence. The confirmation of that reality, when it came, would sting but not devastate me. I had built a life and identity completely independent of their approval or support. The specific bequests began with smaller items, personal effects, and sentimental objects distributed among various family members. My mother's jewelry collection went to Isabel, which seemed appropriate given that she would actually wear and appreciate those pieces. A vintage watch collection my father had maintained went to a nephew who shared his interest in horology. Various furniture items and artwork were designated for specific relatives, each allocation explained briefly by Patterson as he worked through the list. I received nothing in these initial bequests, my absence from the distribution so consistent it became almost predictable. Aunt Catherine caught my eye at one point, her expression sad and knowing, understanding without words how this public confirmation of my parents' priorities must feel regardless of how well I thought I had prepared. "Now we come to the distribution of the estate's primary assets," Patterson continued, his tone shifting slightly to indicate we were approaching more significant matters. Gregory Hartwell's estate consists primarily of the family home in Monterey, valued at approximately $2.8 million, a property portfolio of 3 rental units in Carmel and Pacific Grove collectively valued at approximately $1.5 million, investment accounts totaling approximately $3.2 million, and various other financial instruments and accounts totaling approximately $800,000. The total estate value at the time of Gregory's death was approximately $8.3 million. The numbers landed with weight in the quiet conference room. I had known my parents were financially comfortable, successful in the way that long careers in architecture and strategic investing could provide, but hearing the actual figures articulated so precisely drove home just how much wealth they had accumulated. That wealth, I understood, represented not just money but choices, the ability to support children differently, to invest in relationships, to demonstrate love through both emotional and material means. How they had chosen to distribute those resources in death would be their final statement about our respective value in their eyes. Patterson cleared his throat before continuing. Regarding the distribution of these assets, Gregory's will contain specific instructions that I will now read verbatim. To my daughter Isabel Marie Hartwell, I leave the family home at 1722 Ocean View Drive in Monterey, California, along with all furnishings and contents therein. I leave her the property portfolio consisting of rental units in Carmel and Pacific Grove, which should provide ongoing income to support her lifestyle and needs. I leave her $2 million from my investment accounts, to be transferred upon the settlement of this estate. These bequests are made in recognition of Isabel's ongoing health challenges and her need for financial security given the uncertainties that medical conditions can create. I felt the words settle over me like a physical weight, each clause another confirmation of the hierarchy that had defined our family. Isabel would receive the house we grew up in, properties that generated passive income, and a substantial cash inheritance. The justification, framed around her health challenges, felt both reasonable on its surface and deeply problematic in its implications. Yes, Isabel had faced cancer twice, and yes, those experiences had impacted her earning capacity and created ongoing medical expenses. But the characterization of her as uniquely vulnerable ignored both her current stable health and my own legitimate need for financial security that had never factored into our parents' calculations. Patterson paused, glancing up from the document to gauge the room's reaction before continuing. To my daughter Victoria and Hartwell, I leave the sum of $50,000, to be transferred upon the settlement of this estate. This bequest is made in acknowledgement that Victoria has built a successful independent life and career, demonstrating that she requires less financial support than her sister. The disparity is not a reflection of differential love but rather a practical allocation of resources based on respective needs and circumstances. The amount was so much less than Isabel's inheritance that several people in the room gasped audibly. $50,000 against Isabel's total inheritance of approximately $6 million in property and cash represented a ratio so skewed it was almost laughable. I sat very still, my face carefully neutral, refusing to give anyone in that room the satisfaction of seeing me react to this final dismissal. The explanation my father had included, attempting to frame the disparity as practical rather than preferential, felt like adding insult to injury. My independence, the very quality I had cultivated out of necessity when my parents made clear their attention would always flow toward Isabel, was now being used to justify leaving me almost nothing from an $8 million estate. Beside me, Isabel made a small sound of distress. I could feel her turning toward me, could sense her mounting horror at the specific numbers and the public nature of this revelation, but I kept my eyes fixed on Patterson, waiting for him to finish. There had to be more to this, some additional clause or explanation, because even my parents at their most neglectful had never been quite this explicitly cruel. The will reading was not just a private family matter but a semi-public event with extended family members present, all of whom now had concrete numerical evidence of my parents' assessment of my worth relative to my sisters. Patterson continued reading, his voice taking on a slightly apologetic quality that suggested he found the next portion uncomfortable. However, Victoria's bequest is contingent upon the following conditions being met within 30 days of this will's reading. First, Victoria must provide written documentation proving she underwent bone marrow donation for Isabel on 2 separate occasions, said documentation to include medical records and physician confirmation of the procedures. Second, Victoria must sign a formal letter of apology to Isabel, Gregory, and Diane Hartwell for the conflict and estrangement that characterized the final years of their relationship, acknowledging her role in creating family discord. The conference room erupted into chaos. Multiple relatives began speaking at once, some expressing outrage at the conditions, others defending my parents' right to structure their estate as they saw fit. Isabel stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and I heard her voice cutting through the noise. "This is absolutely unacceptable. This is not what Dad told me was in the will. He said he was leaving Victoria a fair portion. This is unconscionable." I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap, waiting for the room to settle so Patterson could finish reading whatever remained of this document. Patterson raised his voice to be heard over the commotion. Please, let me finish. There are additional provisions that address some of these concerns. The room gradually quieted, everyone returning to their seats with varying degrees of reluctance. Patterson adjusted his glasses and located his place in the document before continuing. Third, Victoria must agree to attend mandatory family counseling sessions with Isabel for a minimum of 6 months, said sessions to be facilitated by a licensed therapist approved by the estate executor. Failure to meet any of these conditions within the specified 30-day timeframe will result in Victoria's $50,000 bequest being redirected to Isabel, making her the sole beneficiary of the entire estate. The silence that followed this revelation felt different from before, heavier with the weight of understanding what my father had actually done. This was not simply a matter of leaving me less money due to practical considerations about our respective financial situations. This was a deliberate trap, a final attempt to force me into compliance with their narrative about my role in our family's dysfunction. The conditions were carefully designed to be humiliating and impossible, requiring me to both prove I had donated bone marrow, as if that fact were in question, and to accept full responsibility for our estrangement through a formal written apology. The family counseling requirement, which might have seemed reasonable in isolation, became another tool of control when combined with the other conditions and the absurdly short timeframe for compliance. Aunt Catherine was the first to speak into the silence, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. This is manipulative and cruel, using a will to try to force Victoria into behaviors Gregory couldn't compel during his lifetime. It's unconscionable to make her inheritance, meager as it is compared to Isabel's, contingent on apologizing for boundaries she had every right to establish. Her words opened the floodgates for other relatives to weigh in, the room dividing predictably between those who saw the will's conditions as reasonable parental guidance and those who recognized them as a final act of control and punishment. Patterson waited for the arguments to subside before speaking again. I understand this is difficult, and I want to be clear that I advised against these conditional provisions when Gregory proposed them. However, he was adamant that this structure reflected his wishes and his hope that it might facilitate healing between his daughters before he passed. Unfortunately, his health declined more rapidly than anticipated, and he died before any such reconciliation could occur. The will as written is legally sound, and unless Victoria chooses to contest it, which is her right, the conditions will remain in effect as stated. I finally spoke, my voice cutting through the murmured conversations with surprising clarity. I won't be contesting the will, and I won't be meeting the conditions. My father was entitled to distribute his estate however he chose, and I accept his decision. The $50,000, generous as some might consider it, is not worth compromising my integrity or accepting responsibility for dysfunction I didn't create. Isabel can have the entire estate with my blessing. I stood up, gathering my bag and preparing to leave, done with this performance and ready to return to my actual life in San Francisco. Isabel grabbed my arm as I moved toward the door, her face streaked with tears I hadn't noticed her crying. Victoria, please wait, we need to talk about this. I cannot accept this inheritance knowing the conditions Dad attached to your portion. This is wrong, and I won't benefit from his manipulation. I looked at my sister, seeing genuine distress and solidarity in her expression, and felt a complicated rush of emotions. Part of me appreciated her immediate rejection of the will structure, her instinctive understanding that our father's final act had been designed to harm me while enriching her. But another part of me, the part that had spent decades navigating family dynamics where my needs were consistently deprioritized, recognized that her distress was ultimately performative unless she took concrete action to rectify the situation. What do you propose? I asked quietly, aware that the entire room was listening to our exchange. Isabel wiped at her tears, her mind clearly working through possibilities. I'll refuse the inheritance, she said. We can petition the court to divide everything equally, 50-50, the way it should have been from the start. Dad's conditions were unconscionable, and I won't participate in perpetuating the favoritism that damaged both of us. Her offer was genuine, I could hear that in her voice, but I also understood the complexity of what she was suggesting. Refusing a $6 million inheritance to make a point about fairness was easier to propose in a moment of emotional clarity than to actually execute when faced with the practical implications. I appreciate that, I said carefully, but I don't want you to refuse your inheritance. Dad left you those assets because he wanted you to have them, and despite everything, I don't think you should reject that gift. What I do want is for you to understand that my relationship with our parents, and the boundaries I established, were necessary for my survival and well-being. I don't need an apology from you or money or anything else except recognition that I made reasonable choices given impossible circumstances. Isabel nodded, her tears flowing more freely now, and pulled me into a hug that felt more natural than any physical affection we had shared during our childhood. Patterson cleared his throat diplomatically, reminding us that we were not alone in the room. If Victoria chooses not to meet the conditions, the estate will be distributed according to the alternative provisions outlined in the will. Isabel will receive the entirety of the assets, and there are no additional contingencies or requirements attached to her inheritance. I would recommend that both sisters take some time to process this information before making final decisions. Victoria has 30 days to reconsider her position, and during that period, the estate will not be distributed to either party. I extracted myself gently from Isabel's embrace and addressed Patterson directly. I won't be reconsidering. Please proceed with distributing the estate to Isabel according to the alternative provisions. I would like a copy of the full will for my records, but I have no intention of contesting or challenging any aspect of the document. My decision is final. Patterson nodded, making notes in the margin of the document before him, and I turned to leave the conference room without waiting for further discussion or debate. The drive back to my parents' house felt surreal, the familiar streets of Monterey passing by while I processed what had just occurred. My father's final act of manipulation had been expertly crafted, designed to either force me into humiliating compliance or confirm the narrative that I was the selfish, ungrateful daughter who cared more about pride than family. The conditions attached to my inheritance were impossible by design, requiring me to accept blame for dynamics he had created and maintained throughout my entire life. The apology he demanded would have required me to deny my own lived experience, to pretend that establishing boundaries against mistreatment constituted the real harm rather than the mistreatment itself. Back at the house, I began the process of packing my belongings and preparing to return to San Francisco. I had taken a week off from work to handle funeral arrangements and family obligations, but staying any longer felt pointless and potentially destructive. Isabel followed me upstairs, hovering in the doorway of the guest room while I folded clothes and organized toiletries. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said quietly. "I can't just accept millions of dollars knowing Dad structured things to punish you one final time. It feels wrong, and I don't know how to make it right." I sat down on the edge of the bed, gesturing for her to join me. "You make it right by living well and using those resources in ways that bring you genuine happiness and fulfillment," I said. "You don't punish yourself or refuse opportunities because Dad was incapable of treating his daughters equitably. What would help me more than any financial redistribution is knowing that you understand why I made the choices I did, and that you won't let our parents' dysfunction continue to define our relationship going forward." Isabel nodded slowly, processing my words with visible effort. I had spent years in therapy working through these exact issues, learning to separate my worth from my parents' assessment of it, but she was just beginning that journey. "Did you know about the conditions?" I asked, curious whether she had been aware of the trap our father had constructed. Isabel shook her head emphatically. "No, I swear to you I had no idea. Dad told me he was updating his will after Mom died, and he said he was making sure we were both taken care of according to our respective situations. He said you were doing well professionally and didn't need as much, but he never mentioned amounts or conditions. I would have fought him on it if I'd known." I believed her, could see the genuine horror and guilt in her expression as she grappled with benefiting from our father's final manipulation. "The truth is," I continued, "that $50,000 against $6 million would have felt insulting regardless of conditions. The ratio tells the story of our entire childhood, the quantifiable proof that I was valued at less than 1% of what you were worth to them. But trying to force me to apologize for protecting myself, to admit fault for their failings, that was the real cruelty. Dad wanted to punish me one last time for refusing to play the role he assigned me, for insisting on being treated with basic dignity and respect." Isabel was crying again, the weight of our family's dysfunction settling over her in ways she was only beginning to comprehend fully. "What do I do with all of it?" she asked helplessly, gesturing vaguely to encompass the house and everything the inheritance represented. How do I live in this house where you were ignored and dismissed? How do I collect rent from properties bought with money that should have been distributed more fairly? I don't want to be the beneficiary of Dad's favoritism anymore. The question was earnest and painful, reflecting her growing awareness of how she had been positioned within our family system not through her own choices but through our parents' deliberate structuring. You figure out what feels right to you, I said gently. Maybe you sell the house and buy something that doesn't carry all this history. Maybe you use the rental income to fund causes you believe in, turn that passive wealth into active good in the world. Maybe you set up a trust for your future children, if you and Derek decide to have them, and break the cycle by treating them equally regardless of their health or personalities or whether they meet your expectations. What you don't do is refuse the inheritance as some grand gesture, because that helps no one and changes nothing about the past. We sat together in that guest room for a long time, talking through decades of family patterns and pain with more honesty than we had ever managed before. Isabel shared her own experiences of feeling suffocated by our parents' excessive attention, how every aspect of her life had been monitored and managed until she struggled to develop independent identity or agency. She described the pressure of being the favorite, the constant awareness that love was contingent on maintaining certain behaviors and meeting specific expectations. Her experience was obviously different from mine, privileged in ways she was only now beginning to recognize, but it had also been damaging in its own way. I shared details I had never articulated before, specific memories of birthdays forgotten and achievements overlooked, the cumulative weight of small dismissals that added up to fundamental rejection. I told her about the bone marrow donation recovery, spending weeks alone in my apartment while our parents devoted themselves to her post-transplant care. I described the engagement party and the wedding contribution request, the moment when I finally understood that my value to our family would always be primarily transactional. Isabel listened without defensiveness or excuses, simply bearing witness to pain she had been too young or too sick or too self-absorbed to notice as it occurred. As evening approached, we ordered takeout and ate dinner together in the kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of a family life that had never truly included both of us equally. The house felt different now, haunted not by my father's recent death but by decades of dysfunction that his will had laid bare for extended family and strangers to see. Tomorrow I would drive back to San Francisco and resume my actual life, the one I had built entirely independent of my parents' support or approval. Tonight, I sat with my sister and mourned together what we had both lost, the family we deserved but never received, and began the process of imagining what we might build together going forward. The following morning brought unexpected visitors. Derek arrived first, having driven down from San Francisco overnight after Isabel called him crying about the will reading. He found us in the kitchen drinking coffee and picked up immediately on the heavy emotional atmosphere. I heard what happened, he said without preamble, and I'm absolutely furious on both your behalves. What your father did was unconscionable, and I hope Isabel told you we're not accepting the inheritance under these circumstances. I appreciated his solidarity, though I had already made peace with the outcome in ways he was still processing. Shortly after Derek's arrival, Aunt Catherine appeared at the door with my Uncle Jim, both of them looking determined and slightly combative. We've been talking with other family members, Catherine announced without preamble, and there's a consensus forming that your father's will is ethically if not legally problematic. Several of us want to provide testimony if you choose to contest it, documenting the favoritism we witnessed throughout your childhood. Uncle Jim nodded emphatically, adding that he had kept detailed journals for years noting family events and dynamics, evidence that could support a claim of undue influence or questionable mental capacity. I was touched by their offers but had no intention of pursuing legal action against my father's will. The process would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately pointless even if successful. Money obtained through legal battle against my dead father's wishes would feel tainted, forever associated with conflict and public examination of family dysfunction. More importantly, contesting the will would require me to invest enormous emotional energy into proving I deserved better treatment, continuing to seek validation from people who had demonstrated conclusively that such validation would never be freely given. I appreciate what you're offering, I told my aunt and uncle sincerely, but I'm not going to contest the will. What my father did was hurtful and manipulative, but it was also clarifying. He's given me the gift of absolute certainty that cutting ties with him was the right decision. I don't need the courts to redistribute his assets or validate that I was treated unfairly. I already know both those things, and I've built a life that doesn't depend on his approval or his money." Catherine looked like she wanted to argue further, but something in my expression must have convinced her I was serious. She hugged me tightly instead, whispering that she was proud of how I had handled impossible circumstances with such grace. Over the next several days, similar conversations played out repeatedly with various family members who had attended the will reading. Some were supportive, horrified by the conditions my father had attached to my inheritance and eager to help me fight back through legal channels. Others were more ambivalent, suggesting that perhaps the conditions weren't unreasonable and that I should consider meeting them for the sake of family harmony. A few were openly hostile, viewing my refusal to apologize and accept responsibility as proof that I was indeed the problematic daughter my parents had portrayed. I listened to all these perspectives with detached interest, noting how people's responses revealed more about their own values and family experiences than about the actual situation at hand. The person whose response mattered most, beyond Isabel herself, was James. I called him the evening after the will reading, walking him through everything that had happened and bracing for his reaction. His response was immediate and unequivocal. "Your father's final act was an attempt to control you from beyond the grave, to force you into compliance through financial manipulation. I'm proud of you for refusing to play along, and I'm honestly relieved you don't want that money. It would have come with strings attached that would have poisoned our lives together." His validation meant everything, confirmation that the partner I had chosen understood and supported my boundaries even when they came with significant financial cost. We discussed the practical implications of my decision. $50,000 would have made a meaningful difference to our financial situation, allowing us to accelerate certain goals like expanding my beach house or contributing more aggressively to retirement accounts. Walking away from that amount was not a trivial choice, particularly when it represented such a tiny fraction of an $8 million estate. But James agreed that the conditions attached made acceptance impossible, and that we would be fine financially without it. Our life was built on dual professional incomes and careful planning, not on inheritance from family members who used money as a tool of control. Isabel's response evolved over the days following the will reading. Initially, she was determined to refuse the entire inheritance or to redistribute it equally regardless of our father's wishes. She met with lawyers about the possibility of creating a trust that would split everything 50-50, finding legal mechanisms to circumvent the will's specific allocations. She talked about selling the family home immediately and dividing the proceeds, using the rental properties to fund charitable causes we both cared about, essentially any option that would avoid benefiting from our father's final act of favoritism. I talked her down from these grand gestures, helping her understand that refusing the inheritance wouldn't change anything about the past and might actually create new problems. The estate would likely revert to more distant relatives if she disclaimed it, people who had no connection to the family dynamics or understanding of what the money represented. Better that Isabel accept the inheritance and use it thoughtfully than to allow it to disappear into legal complexity that served no one. We compromised on a solution that felt workable for both of us. Isabel would accept the full inheritance as structured in the will, but she would create a separate financial arrangement between us that acknowledged the unfairness of the distribution. The arrangement we developed was both practical and symbolic. Isabel established an investment account in my name with an initial deposit of $1 million, representing a more equitable distribution of our father's estate. This money came with no conditions or expectations, simply her recognition that the original will had been unconscionable and her desire to rectify that disparity. Additionally, she committed to covering all medical expenses if I ever faced health crises, a practical safety net given my history of donating bone marrow and the potential long-term impacts of that procedure. These arrangements were formalized through legal documents that ensured they couldn't be later challenged or reversed, making them as binding as the original will itself. I accepted this arrangement after considerable reflection and therapy sessions exploring my complicated feelings about receiving anything connected to my father's estate. Dr. Chen helped me distinguish between accepting my sister's genuine attempt to make amends and capitulating to my parents' manipulation. The money came from Isabel's choices, her autonomy and her values, not from compliance with conditions designed to humiliate me. It represented her solidarity and recognition of injustice rather than validation from parents who had proven themselves incapable of providing it. In that context, accepting felt different from the compromised acceptance that meeting my father's conditions would have required. The legal finalization of the estate took several months, during which time I had returned fully to my life in San Francisco. Work provided welcome distraction, complex investment analyses requiring the kind of focused attention that left little room for dwelling on family dysfunction. James and I began planning renovations for the beach house, projects we could now fund more comfortably thanks to Isabel's financial arrangement. I continued therapy, processing layers of grief that involved not just my father's death but the death of any remaining hope that our relationship might have eventually healed. Isabel moved forward with her own healing journey, selling the family home without ever living in it and purchasing a smaller property that carried no painful history. She maintained the rental properties, using the income to fund environmental conservation projects and to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing environmental science degrees. Derek supported her completely through all these transitions, their marriage strengthening through shared values and mutual care. Watching my sister build a life based on her actual interests and values, freed from our parents' excessive management, felt redemptive in ways I hadn't anticipated. The 1-year anniversary of my father's death passed quietly. I didn't attend any memorial service or family gathering, choosing instead to spend the day hiking with James in Point Reyes, surrounded by natural beauty that had nothing to do with the family I was born into. Isabel called that evening to check in, and we talked for over an hour about grief and relief and the complexity of mourning people who had damaged us even as we loved them. She shared that she had finally completed therapy processing her own relationship with our parents, recognizing patterns of conditional love and excessive control that had shaped her just as profoundly as neglect had shaped me. 2 years after the will reading, Isabel and Derek welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Elena Grace. I drove down to Monterey to meet my niece, holding this tiny person and feeling the weight of generational patterns that we both desperately wanted to break. Isabel had already spoken with Dr. Chin about strategies for ensuring Elena would feel loved unconditionally, parenting approaches that didn't recreate the favoritism or neglect that had characterized our own childhood. I watched my sister with her daughter, noting the tenderness and attention she brought to even mundane caregiving tasks, and felt hopeful that this new generation might experience family differently. James and I had decided not to have children, a choice that felt right for various reasons including concerns about perpetuating family dysfunction and simple preference for our current lifestyle. But being Aunt Victoria to Elena allowed me to participate in nurturing the next generation without the primary responsibility of parenthood. I could spoil my niece with attention and gifts, be present for important milestones, and help shape her understanding of family in ways that honored complexity while building toward healing. Isabel and I had explicit conversations about how to talk with Elena eventually about her grandparents, how to acknowledge their existence and their flaws without either demonizing them or pretending the damage they caused didn't matter. The money Isabel had provided sat in investment accounts, growing steadily and providing financial security I had never expected to have. James and I used portions of it to fund projects we cared about, donating to causes supporting bone marrow research and patient advocacy, contributing to environmental conservation efforts Isabel championed, and establishing our own small scholarship fund for first-generation college students pursuing careers in finance. The wealth felt less tainted when deployed toward purposes that reflected our values rather than simply enriching our personal lives. 3 years after my father's death, I received an unexpected letter from Patterson, the lawyer who had handled the estate. He was retiring and closing his practice, and in the process of organizing files, he had come across some documents he thought I might want to see. We met at a coffee shop in Carmel, and he handed me a folder containing correspondence between himself and my father from the months before Dad's death. The letters revealed that Patterson had strongly advised against the conditional structure of my inheritance, arguing that it was legally risky and ethically questionable. My father's responses to Patterson's concerns were illuminating. He maintained that the conditions were necessary to force me to acknowledge my role in family discord, to accept responsibility for the estrangement that had characterized our final years. He believed that requiring an apology and proof of the bone marrow donations would either result in genuine reconciliation or would confirm his assessment that I valued pride over family. There was no consideration in his letters of the possibility that I had legitimate grievances, that boundaries I established were necessary rather than petulant, that his own behavior might have been the primary driver of our broken relationship. Reading those letters provided a strange sort of closure. My father had died believing himself the wronged party, convinced that I was the problem and that his will's conditions represented a final attempt at tough love rather than manipulation. He genuinely could not see the patterns Catherine and other relatives had documented, the lifetime of favoritism and neglect that had created the very estrangement he mourned. His inability to acknowledge his own role in our fractured relationship was both sad and liberating. I had done nothing wrong by protecting myself, and his failure to understand that reflected his limitations rather than my failings. I shared the letters with Isabel during one of our regular video calls, watching her face as she read our father's words. She was quiet for a long time after finishing, processing yet another layer of family dysfunction. "He really believed he was right," she said finally, her voice filled with sadness. "He genuinely thought you were the problem, that if you would just apologize and submit to his version of reality, everything would be fine. It's heartbreaking how incapable he was of self-reflection or accountability." We sat together in silence, connected across distance by shared understanding of the parents we had both loved and been damaged by in different ways. 5 years after the will reading, my life looked nothing like what my father had imagined when he structured that final attempt at control. James and I had expanded the beach house, creating a sanctuary that reflected our values and provided space for the chosen family we had built. My career had flourished, senior leadership at Morrison Securities recognizing my expertise and promoting me to partner. Isabel's environmental work had gained national recognition, her projects protecting coastal ecosystems and inspiring policy changes. Derek had been offered a significant position with a pharmaceutical company developing sustainable manufacturing processes, and they were expecting their second child. The wealth from my father's estate, redistributed through Isabel's choice rather than his design, had enabled various good works and provided security without defining our lives. I thought sometimes about the $50,000 I had walked away from, the amount that seemed almost laughable compared to what Isabel had gifted me later. My father had believed that money could control behavior, that financial leverage would force compliance with his narrative about our family. He had been wrong, and that wrongness had been expensive for him in ways he probably never anticipated. The final accounting of my relationship with my parents came not through any dramatic confrontation or tearful reconciliation but through simple passage of time and accumulation of different experiences. I had built a life that honored my worth, surrounded myself with people who valued my presence rather than my utility, and learned that family could be chosen rather than merely endured. The bone marrow donations that should have bonded me to my sister had instead become the catalyst for understanding my value couldn't be earned through grand gestures or painful sacrifices. Love freely given, the kind James offered and Isabel had learned to provide, was the only kind worth having. Looking back now, I can see how every choice I made after refusing my father's conditional inheritance was an act of self-preservation and self-respect. Walking away from that money, demanding better treatment, insisting on boundaries that honored my humanity, these weren't acts of spite or vengeance but rather necessary steps toward building a life worth living. My father's will had been designed to punish me one final time, to force compliance or confirm my unworthiness. Instead, it had given me the gift of absolute clarity about who he was and who I had become despite his influence. The scar on my abdomen remained, physical evidence of the lengths I had gone to save my sister's life. But it no longer represented sacrifice without recognition or love without reciprocation. It had become simply a mark of something I had survived, a medical procedure that contributed to Isabel's continued health while teaching me crucial lessons about my own worth. Some days I touched that scar and felt proud of the woman who had donated bone marrow out of genuine care for her sister. Other days I touched it and felt proud of the woman who had refused to donate again under conditions that compromised her integrity and well-being. My relationship with Isabel continued to deepen and mature, two women who had survived the same family system emerging with different scars but shared understanding. We celebrated holidays together now, creating new traditions that had nothing to do with our parents' preferences or expectations. Elena and her younger brother Thomas knew me as Aunt Victoria, who told stories and brought interesting gifts and listened when they talked about their interests. They would grow up knowing that family could be complicated, that sometimes boundaries were necessary, that love required more than biological connection. The final chapter of this story isn't about revenge or vindication or even reconciliation with people who had died still believing their treatment of me was justified. It's about liberation, the freedom that comes from finally releasing the need for approval from people incapable of providing it. My father's will, with its impossible conditions and explicit favoritism, had been one last test of whether I would compromise myself for crumbs of acceptance. I had passed that test by refusing to participate, by walking away from money that came with strings designed to strangle my sense of self. On quiet mornings at the beach house, watching fog roll in over the Pacific, I sometimes thought about alternate versions of my life. What if I had been the favored child, the one whose needs consistently took precedence? What if my parents had loved me the way they loved Isabel, with attention and resources and unwavering support? Would I be happier, more successful, more fulfilled? The answer, I had come to understand, was probably not. The independence I cultivated out of necessity had become my greatest strength, the foundation upon which I built a life of genuine authenticity and purpose. My parents had given me many things over my lifetime. A comfortable childhood home, educational opportunities, the genetic material that made donating bone marrow to my sister possible. But the most valuable gift, though they never intended it as such, was the clarity that came from their consistent prioritization of Isabel over me. That clarity taught me to stop seeking validation from sources incapable of providing it, to build my worth from internal rather than external measures, and to create family through choice and mutual care rather than blood obligation alone. The money sat in investment accounts, growing and funding projects that mattered. My career flourished through competence and dedication. My marriage thrived through mutual respect and genuine partnership. My relationship with Isabel deepened through honest communication and shared commitment to breaking dysfunctional patterns. And I carried the scar from bone marrow donation as a reminder not of what I had sacrificed but of what I had survived and how far I had come from the woman who once believed grand gestures might earn love that should have been freely given all along. In the end, my father's will had tried to write one final chapter to a story he believed was about my failings and ingratitude. Instead, it became the epilogue that confirmed everything I already knew. I was worth more than $50,000 with impossible conditions attached. I was worth more than scrambling for crumbs of attention and approval. I was worth the life I had built, the family I had chosen, and the boundaries I had established. And no will, no matter how carefully crafted to punish or control, could change that fundamental truth. 10 years have passed since that conference room in Monterey, and the woman I am now barely resembles the person who sat listening to my father's final attempt at manipulation. The beach house has become more than a weekend retreat. It's transformed into a gathering place where chosen family celebrates milestones and weathered storms together. Last month we hosted Elena's 10th birthday party here, watching her run along the shoreline with her brother and cousins, their laughter carried on the salt air like a promise that cycles can be broken and new patterns established. Isabel sold the last of the rental properties 2 years ago, redirecting that capital into a conservation trust that protects coastal wetlands from development. She speaks at conferences now, her work recognized nationally, and the tentative woman who once drifted through jobs searching for purpose has been replaced by someone who knows exactly what she stands for and fights for it daily. Derek remains her steady partner, their marriage a testament to what happens when two people choose each other repeatedly through both ordinary days and extraordinary challenges. Their third child, a son they named after my father despite everything, arrived last spring, and I held him in the hospital feeling none of the bitterness that might have poisoned such a moment years earlier. James and I celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary with a month-long trip through New Zealand, hiking trails and sampling wines and talking about what we wanted the next phase of our lives to look like. We've decided to take early retirement in 5 years, using the financial security Isabel's gift provided to step back from demanding careers and focus on projects that feed our souls rather than our bank accounts. I've been mentoring young women in finance, teaching them not just analytical skills but the art of establishing boundaries and recognizing their worth beyond professional achievement. James has taken up woodworking, creating furniture pieces he donates to organizations serving families transitioning out of homelessness. The investment accounts continue growing, numbers on screens that represent security and possibility but don't define our days or dictate our choices. We funded a new wing at the Children's Hospital where Isabel received her cancer treatment, a bright space filled with natural light and comfortable furniture where families can rest while their loved ones undergo procedures. The plaque doesn't mention my parents or the complicated inheritance that made the donation possible, it simply honors all the families who have faced pediatric illness with courage and resilience. Isabel cried when we toured the completed wing together, understanding without words that this was how we transformed pain into purpose. Aunt Catherine passed away 3 years ago, and at her memorial service I delivered a eulogy celebrating the aunt who had seen me clearly when my own parents couldn't or wouldn't. She left me a small inheritance, mostly books and photographs and a handwritten letter expressing pride in the woman I had become despite the obstacles my childhood presented. That letter sits framed in my home office, a reminder that blood family occasionally produces people capable of genuine love and support. Uncle Jim still calls every few months to check in, our conversations wandering through topics from politics to gardening, the easy exchanges of people who care about each other without agenda or expectation. The extended family has largely moved on from the drama of my father's will, though occasionally someone will reference it at gatherings with knowing glances that suggest they understand more than was ever explicitly discussed. A few relatives remain cool toward me, still believing some version of the narrative my parents constructed about my unreasonable demands and family betrayal. I've made peace with their judgment, recognizing that people interpret situations through the lens of their own experiences and values. Their opinions don't determine my worth any more than my parents' assessment did. I returned to Monterey last month for the first time in years, driving through familiar streets that held decades of complicated memories. The house where I grew up has been renovated by its new owners, the exterior painted a cheerful yellow that bears no resemblance to the subdued colors my parents preferred. I parked across the street and sat for a few minutes, looking at windows that once framed my childhood and feeling remarkably little. This building was just a structure now, bricks and wood that housed different people living different lives, and whatever power it once held over my imagination had dissipated entirely. The cemetery where my parents are buried received its first visit from me that same afternoon. I stood at their shared headstone reading dates and the bland inscription they had chosen for themselves, beloved parents and grandparents, and felt the same emotional distance I experienced looking at their former house. These people had shaped my early life profoundly, their neglect and favoritism creating wounds that required years of therapy and conscious effort to heal. But they no longer occupied space in my daily thoughts or influenced my choices about how to live and love. I didn't leave flowers or stand in contemplative silence performing grief I didn't feel. Instead, I simply acknowledged their existence and their death, two facts that shaped my story without defining it, and then I drove to meet Isabel for dinner at a restaurant overlooking the bay. We talked about Elena's growing interest in marine biology and Thomas's obsession with building elaborate structures from whatever materials he could find and the new baby's remarkably calm temperament. We discussed the Conservation Trust's latest land acquisition and my retirement plans and Derek's frustration with pharmaceutical industry bureaucracy. Normal conversation between sisters who had learned to know each other as whole people rather than assigned roles. The bone marrow scar has faded over the years, still visible but no longer the angry red line it once was. I touch it sometimes and remember the woman who underwent that procedure believing it might finally earn her parents' love, and I feel compassion for her without wishing I could return to being her. That version of myself did the best she could with the understanding she had at the time, and she survived experiences that could have broken her entirely. She learned eventually that survival wasn't enough, that she deserved to thrive rather than simply endure, and she made choices that honored that realization even when those choices came with devastating costs. The scholarship fund James and I established has now supported 32 first-generation college students through their education, young people who remind me of my younger self, working twice as hard for half the recognition and learning to validate themselves when external sources prove unreliable. We meet with recipients occasionally, listening to their dreams and challenges, offering not just financial support but mentorship and genuine interest in their lives beyond what they can achieve or produce. Several have stayed in touch long after graduation, sending updates about careers and relationships and the families they're building based on healthier models than the ones they grew up with. Dr. Chen retired last year after 15 years of helping me untangle the complicated knots of family trauma and build a life based on authentic values rather than reactive self-protection. Our final session focused not on what I had survived but on what I had created, the relationships and projects and daily practices that brought genuine satisfaction rather than just absence of pain. She reminded me that healing isn't linear, that old wounds sometimes ache unexpectedly, but that I had developed tools to navigate those moments without being consumed by them. I left her office for the last time feeling grateful for her guidance and confident in my ability to continue the work without professional support. Elena asked me recently why she doesn't see her other grandmother and grandfather, the age when children start noticing absences and asking direct questions about family structure. Isabel and I had prepared for this conversation, agreeing on language that acknowledged complexity without burdening a child with adult dysfunction. I explained that sometimes family members aren't able to treat each other with kindness and respect, and when that happens, adults have to make difficult choices about what relationships to maintain. I told her that her grandparents loved her mother very much but struggled to love me in healthy ways, and that I made a choice to protect myself by creating distance. She seemed satisfied with this explanation, returning to her book without the anxiety or confusion I had feared such honesty might create. The final truth I've learned through this journey is that closure doesn't always look like reconciliation or explicit resolution. Sometimes closure is simply the gradual diminishment of pain's intensity, the slow process of building a life so full of genuine connection that old wounds become historical facts rather than present realities. My parents died believing I was the problem, and I've made peace with never changing that perception or receiving the acknowledgement I once desperately craved. Their assessment of my worth has no bearing on the life I've built or the person I've become. James found me this morning standing on our deck watching fog obscure the ocean, lost in thoughts about family and inheritance and the ways we're shaped by both acceptance and rejection. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and asked what I was thinking about, and I realized I had been contemplating not my parents or the will or any of the old pain but rather the dinner party we're hosting tonight for friends who have become family. I was mentally reviewing the menu and considering which wine to serve and looking forward to the laughter and conversation that would fill our home with warmth and connection freely given and received. That shift in focus, from past wounds to present joys, represents the real inheritance I claimed for myself. Not the $50,000 with impossible conditions, not even the million Isabel provided through her own choices, but the understanding that I could build a life worth living entirely independent of my parents' approval or support. There will try to write my story's ending, attempted to force compliance or confirm unworthiness one final time. Instead it became simply another chapter in a much longer narrative about learning to honor my own worth and surround myself with people capable of seeing and celebrating it. The fog is lifting now, revealing the coastline I've come to love and the home I've created that reflects my actual values rather than inherited expectations. Inside, James is setting the table for tonight's gathering while music plays softly through speakers we installed last summer. My phone shows a text from Isabel confirming they're still coming and asking if she should bring anything beyond the dessert she already promised. Everything is exactly as it should be, built carefully and deliberately by a woman who refused to accept crumbs when she deserved the feast, who walked away from conditional love and found unconditional acceptance, who transformed pain into purpose and built family from choice rather than obligation. This is where the story ends and where real life continues. Not with dramatic confrontation or tearful reconciliation but with quiet satisfaction and genuine peace. My fathers will fail to control me from beyond the grave, and in that failure, I found my freedom. The bone marrow I donated saved my sister's life twice, but refusing to donate again under impossible conditions saved my own life in ways that matter infinitely more. I have no regrets about the choices I made, the boundaries I established, or the family I lost in order to find myself. And that certainty, that bone-deep knowledge that I chose correctly, is worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.